So we've been knitting round and round and we're very nearly done. Got a little bit of wool left. So I think one thing that's very important when you're learning to knit is how to read your knitting and how to fix mistakes. So you can see now this side, this is called stocking stitch. So when we've got, if we're working in the round, we're always on the same side. If we always knit, we will get what's known as stocking stitch or stockinette if you're in America. And you get these little columns of V's like this. Now if you're knitting backwards and forwards, to get stocking stitch you would knit one row, the right side, this side, you would knit that one, and then when you turn you would purl on the other side. But when you're knitting in the round you're always on the same side, so you're always knitting. If you knit every row backwards and forwards you get what's called garter stitch. An example of garter stitch here. So garter stitch comes out like a series of little ridges, so you can see it looks different to the columns of V's. So you can see under your stitch the little V, so that V there is the stitch that you've just knitted, so that one's going to become a V under the stitch when we knit it on the next round. If you make a mistake and want to go back and fix the mistake, so back here you can see these two little lumps where I've purled, which I'll talk about in a minute. So to unknit, or tink, which is knitting backwards, let's take the point of our left hand needle and put it in to that V, which was the stitch below. We're then going to pull the needle, the right hand needle, out of the stitch we've just done, and there we go, one stitch unknitted. So we put the needle in, so we can go back stitch at a time and pick up a drop stitch, or you know, if we split the yarn, you might, when you take your knitted stitch, you might go into the yarn and split it so it doesn't quite sit on the right bit. So you would then unknit that, pull it back and go in properly. So there's lots of reasons. A very common beginner mistake is a stitch that looks like this. So you can see we've got a normal stitch with a V at the bottom, normal stitch with a V at the bottom, normal stitch with a V at the bottom, and then this one. Now what's happened here is we haven't pulled that new stitch through the old stitch. So we're going to unknit the last one, get back to this one, see that it's just wrapped around and the old stitch has just been slipped from one needle to the other without being knitted. So we can do it again, this time pull it through and off properly. So unknitting is really handy. So I'll show you purl again. So knitting every stitch in the round gives you stocking stitch, but you might want rib. I haven't got any rib to hand. Oh, there's some. There we go, rib on the bottom of my jumper. So to rib you would alternate between knitting and purling. So you might knit one stitch, purl one stitch, or knit two stitches, purl two stitches. That was a 2x2 rib I just showed you. So when we're knitting, the wool's out the back. When we're purling, we're going to bring the wool between the needles so it's coming out the front towards us. We're then going to go into the stitch the other way. So we're going to go in from right to left, from up like that. We're then going to take the wool that's sticking out and towards us, we're going to go round the needle that way. And then we're going to scoop that stitch out the back. So it's basically, if you knit in a mirror and look in the mirror, that's what the purl looks like. So it's all the other way. So you can see now our purl stitch is like a little bar under the new stitch. So here's our knit stitch, which is a V, and our purl stitch is a bar. So if you're doing rib, it's very easy to get out of sync if you're doing knit two, purl two. So there's another purl, and then we go back to take the wool back between the needles and go in that way to do our knit. Let's do two knit, and then we're going to pull the wool back towards us through the needles. We're going to go in from right to left, up the way in front. We're going to take it round the needle like that and scoop it out the back. So we'll do 2 of those. Once the wool's out the front towards you, you don't need to move it again until you're ready to knit. And you take it back and we knit. Now, this is the first row, so you can't really spot mistakes, but when you're doing a second row, you can see, so we've got 2 purl stitches there where the little purl bumps are, and then we've got 2 knit stitches where our little V's go straight down, and then here we've got 2 purl stitches, again with the little bars, and 2 knit stitches. So when we come to do our next round, you know that if you see those ones, those are your purls, and those are your knits. So it's much easier to stop and look at what you're doing than it is to try and count them and lose track. So you see this is our stocking stitch on the right side. If we look on the wrong side, and that is reverse stocking stitch, you can see all these the purl bumps on the wrong side. So when you're knitting in the round like this, one thing that's very common to do is if you put it down and go and make a cup of tea, when you pick it up again, I mean it's much easier to tell when you've got more on your needle, but were a small child, for example, to be messing with it, you picked it up like this, it's quite easy for people to go back the way they came. So instead of continuing to knit around like that, you might pick it up and start going back the way you came. Now, the easy way to tell is that you've got the wrong side facing you. So we'll turn it back the right way, and we've got the right side facing us. The other thing, the working yarn on the ball is always attached to the last stitch you knitted. So that will always be on the right hand side. So you know the next one is the next one along. So what have we done? We've done purling, we've done unknitting, talked about reading your knitting. So the last thing you're going to do when you have only about a row's, yeah, I've probably got 2 rows there, I could do maybe another row, but when you've got enough wool left that you could think you can probably do another row, time to cast off. So this is where we finish our knitting. So what we're going to do, and when you're working in the round you can just start anywhere, but we're going to knit 2 stitches, and then we're going to use the tip of our left hand needle to lift that first stitch of the 2 that we knitted over the second of the 2 that we knitted and off, and that's cast off 1 stitch and we're left with 1. So now we're going to do it again. We're going to knit 1 stitch, so we now have 2 on our right hand needle, and use the tip of our left hand needle to lift that first stitch over the second stitch, and there's our second stitch cast off. So you'll continue to do this until all your stitches are cast off and you'll be left with just 1 on the needle. So knit 1 and then use the tip of your needle to lift it off, and you can start to see our cast off row there. So you need as much wool to cast off as it takes to knit around. So once you've cast off all your stitches, you should be left with 1. We should have got back. We'll be left with this last stitch. That stitch we're going to pull till it's big enough that we can fit the end of the yarn through it. And then pull. Oh, I've got this end down here caught up with it. Pull that, and that finishes it off. You'll then use your darning needle to weave in, sort of poke it into some of these purl bumps so that the end is tucked away and hidden. You don't want to cut it off here or it'll come unravelled, and you don't want to leave it hanging because that'll look messy. So do this cast off all the way around your needle until you've left with your last stitch. Pull it up, end through, pull tight, and then you can weave in your ends. Ta-da!